I loved my little lake. Every morning I would grab my rod, sip my coffee, and watch the mist curl over the water like it was hiding secrets just for me. The birds would start their morning chorus, and the only sounds I'd hear were the gentle lapping of the water and the occasional splash of a fish jumping. This was my escape, my slice of peace in a world that rarely let you breathe. I liked to joke that I was the lake's only true neighbor. Sure, there were houses around, but most of them were just structures. They didn't care about the water the way I did. I did. I felt like the lake and I had an unspoken understanding. It was mine in a way that mattered, even if legally it wasn't exactly mine. At first, everything was perfect. Mornings blurred into afternoons filled with quiet reflection and occasional fishing victories. I even had a favorite spot under an old willow tree where the branches nearly kissed the water, perfect for casting my line without anyone seeing me. That willow became my sanctuary. Sometimes, when the wind blew just right, I could almost hear the water whispering, "Don't worry, you're safe here." I laughed to myself, imagining I had conversations with the lake like it was a trusted friend. Then the letters started arriving. The first one was polite, almost formal, but the words made my stomach tight. It was from the HOA warning me that certain activities on my property were under review. I read it twice, then a third time, hoping I had misread it. Fishing apparently was under scrutiny. I stared at the paper, thinking maybe they had made a mistake. I even chuckled a little. Maybe they were just overzealous about a small pond in the neighborhood. Surely they wouldn't make a big deal out of it. But the tone of the letters changed quickly. The next one was sharper, almost threatening. Suddenly, the HOA wasn't just concerned, they were angry. They were sending reminders about rules I didn't know existed, rules that seemed designed for a completely different universe where lakes didn't exist and people didn't fish for fun. I tried to laugh it off, imagining the HOA board as a group of villainous characters in a poorly written drama, shaking their fists at a tiny pond. But the humor couldn't mask the creeping tension. Something about the formality, the precision of their words felt cold. It wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was personal. I tried to reason with them. I made calls, left polite voicemails, even sent emails laying out my perspective. After all, I wasn't doing anything harmful. I was fishing, enjoying the water, keeping it clean, respecting the environment, but it felt like I was speaking to a wall. Every response from them was clipped, calculated, and frustratingly vague. They never answered my questions directly. Instead, they repeated the same lines about rules and violations, as if repeating it enough would make it real. Every time I received another letter, my heartbeat quickened. The suspense of what they might do next started to gnaw at me. I began noticing small changes around the lake. New signs appeared on neighbors' lawns about water usage, about dock placement. It was subtle, but I could feel the shifting energy, the undercurrent of tension. My peaceful mornings started to feel less like relaxation and more like a countdown to an inevitable confrontation. I kept fishing, kept pretending it was normal, but the letters, the signs, the whispers of HOA rules everywhere, they were like shadows creeping over my little paradise. Little did I know, the real storm hadn't even arrived yet. The letters were just the beginning, a warning shot across the bow. Soon, the calm water of my lake would become a battleground. I didn't know how, I didn't know when, but I could feel it in my gut. My quiet fishing mornings were about to be interrupted in a way I would never forget. I just didn't realize how intense things were about to get. The lake that had always been my sanctuary was about to turn into the center of a drama I never asked for. And with that thought, I picked up my rod, cast my line, and waited, knowing deep down that nothing about this would stay peaceful for long. The next letter arrived on a Tuesday, like a punch I wasn't ready for. It wasn't polite anymore. It wasn't even friendly. It was the kind of letter that made you reread every word to make sure you weren't hallucinating. The HOA informed me in no uncertain terms that certain activities on my property were violating neighborhood rules, and failure to comply would result in fines. Fines, overfishing. I stared at it for a long time, trying to wrap my head around the absurdity. I even laughed out loud, imagining the HOA board sitting in some fluorescent-lit room, drafting rules about how I cast my line. The mental image was so ridiculous it almost made me forget my rising anxiety. I tried calling. I picked up the phone and dialed their office, rehearsing my tone to be calm, reasonable, persuasive. I was ready to present my case with facts, with logic, with the charm of a person who genuinely loves their backyard. The call went to voicemail. I left a message. A polite, professional, heartfelt message. No response, so I tried again, same result. Each unanswered call made my pulse race. The suspense was mounting. What could they possibly be planning next? The tension didn't stay confined to letters and phone calls. Subtle signs started appearing around the neighborhood. I noticed a new sign by the lake's edge at a nearby property. It read "Private Dock Regulations Enforced." I didn't even know that was a thing. Who enforced it? The HOA, apparently. It was like watching a slow-moving storm roll in from the horizon. I knew it was coming, and I could see the first flashes of lightning, but I didn't know the exact moment it would strike. I tried to keep my routine to maintain the illusion that nothing was wrong. I fished every morning, brewed my coffee, watched the mist on the water. Humor became my coping mechanism. I would imagine myself narrating a documentary titled "The Man Who Fought the Hoa with Nothing But a Fishing Rod and Stubbornness." I even practiced my dramatic monologues in the mirror. It helped at least a little. But behind the humor was a gnawing sense of unease. Each day I wondered what new letter would arrive, what rule I might accidentally break, what new threat might appear in the form of a polite but deadly sentence from the HOA. Then came the meeting notice. They were holding a board meeting about lake compliance and neighborhood standards, and my attendance was requested. I felt my stomach drop. A polite request, they said. No need to worry, they said. But my imagination had already started spinning scenes of a dozen HOA board members in stiff chairs, glaring at me while I tried to explain that I was just fishing in my own backyard. I pictured the room filled with rules printed on pastel-colored paper, each one more absurd than the last. The suspense was unbearable. I didn't know what to expect, and that made everything feel more intense. The day of the meeting arrived, and I walked in trying to appear calm. The room smelled faintly of coffee and power, a combination that made every sentence feel heavier. I introduced myself politely, smiled where appropriate, and tried to speak in a tone that suggested cooperation. They listened, nodding occasionally, but there was a tension in the air that suggested they were already on the offensive. I could almost feel the energy in the room thickening, like fog rolling over my lake. As the meeting went on, I realized something critical. This wasn't going to be a simple misunderstanding. This was about control. They weren't just enforcing rules, they were asserting dominance. Every rule they cited felt like a carefully placed chess piece, each designed to corner me. I left the meeting with my head spinning, heart racing, and a determination that surprised even me. I wasn't going to back down. I couldn't. Back at my lake that evening, I sat in silence, letting the water calm my nerves. I realized the situation had escalated far beyond letters and polite notices. It was now a battle of patience, knowledge, and strategy. I didn't know how it would end, but one thing was certain: this was no longer just about fishing. It was about standing my ground, and the suspense of what came next was unbearable. I didn't yet know that soon the cops would get involved, and my quiet lake would become the stage for a showdown I never saw coming. I had just settled into my usual fishing spot one morning, hopping to drown my worries in the calm rhythm of the water, when I saw flashing lights across the driveway. My stomach dropped. Police cars on my property. My first thought was that it had to be a mistake. Maybe someone had reported a burglary, maybe a lost pet, anything but this. I gripped my rod like it was a lifeline and walked toward the cars, trying to look calm, though my heart was pounding like a drum. Two officers stepped out, badges glinting in the early sun. They approached politely, but there was an unmistakable firmness in their steps. One of them cleared his throat. "We received a complaint about activity on your property," he said. My mind raced. Activity? Was fishing now a crime? I tried to joke, hopping to diffuse the tension. "You mean catching fish is illegal now?" I asked, smiling nervously. They didn't laugh. They didn't even crack a smile. The humor fell flat, leaving me feeling exposed. The officers asked a few questions. I explained that I owned the property, that I was just fishing, that everything was calm and peaceful. They nodded politely but didn't commit to any judgment. It was surreal. I had always imagined running into the cops in extreme scenarios: car chases, bank heists, dramatic crimes, never over a fishing lake, never over a battle with the HOA. And yet here it was, happening to me in slow motion. I could feel my pulse quicken. The lake that had always been my sanctuary suddenly felt different, like a battlefield. The tension was thick, almost tangible. The officers left after taking notes and reminding me that complaints had been filed. As their cars disappeared down the street, I felt a mix of relief and anxiety. The immediate danger was gone, but now the stakes had changed. The HOA had escalated, and I was officially in their crosshairs. After they left, I paced along the shoreline, trying to process what had just happened. The water reflected the morning sun, sparkling as if nothing had changed, but everything had. The lake seemed quieter, almost ominous, like it was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Humor crept back in as I imagined the HOA board sitting around a table, smugly thinking they had me cornered, unaware that I was already plotting my response. That night I couldn't sleep. The flashing lights kept replaying in my mind, the polite but firm tone of the officers echoing over and over. I realized something crucial: I couldn't just react emotionally. I needed to be strategic. If the HOA could involve the cops over something as trivial as fishing, I had to find a way to protect myself and my lake legally. The suspense was almost unbearable. I felt like a character in a thriller where every move counted and one mistake could tip the balance. I spent hours at my desk scribbling notes, looking up water laws, property rights, and local regulations. My frustration was mixed with fascination. The deeper I dug, the more I realized that I wasn't as powerless as I thought. The law was complicated, full of loopholes and protections that even the HOA probably didn't understand. Each discovery felt like finding a secret weapon. Suspense gave way to excitement. I could see the outline of a plan forming in my mind, a way to turn the tables without ever raising my voice again. The next morning, I returned to the lake, fishing quietly, but now every ripple in the water seemed to echo with possibility. The cops had been a wake-up call, a dramatic reminder that I couldn't ignore the situation any longer. The lake, once a simple retreat, had become a stage for strategy, patience, and perhaps a little poetic justice. And yet I knew the real confrontation hadn't happened yet. The letters, the meetings, the cops, they were all just preludes. The real battle was coming, and I had to be ready. Every cast of my line, every step along the shore was a rehearsal for what was next. The suspense was electric. I could feel it in the air, in the mist, in the way the fish seemed to watch me like silent witnesses to the drama unfolding. Little did I know, the next move would take me deeper into legal waters than I had ever imagined, and the showdown with the HOA would become something I could never have predicted. My quiet lake mornings were gone, replaced by tension, strategy, and a fight for my own backyard. The story was far from over, and the suspense was just beginning to peak. After the cops left, I realized that sitting around and stewing wasn't going to help. I had to do my homework. I grabbed my laptop, a stack of legal guides, and a notepad and set up camp at my kitchen table like some overcaffeinated detective. I was determined to understand the rules of this battle, to figure out how a fishing lake had turned into a legal minefield. The suspense was palpable. Every search felt like peeling back a layer of a mystery I didn't even know existed. I started with water laws, property rights, anything that mentioned lakes, docks, or private access. At first, it was overwhelming. Legalese filled the pages, words I didn't fully understand jumped out at me, and footnotes seemed designed to confuse anyone who wasn't a lawyer. I laughed at myself, imagining I had become a reluctant scholar, learning arcane rules for the sake of my own backyard sanity. It was ridiculous, stressful, and thrilling all at once. Hours passed. The glow of the laptop screen made my living room feel like a war room. I scribbled notes furiously, highlighting sections that seemed relevant, bookmarking websites, and printing out anything that looked like it could help. Each discovery felt like uncovering a secret passage in a game. A clause here, a regulation there. Suddenly, I realized the law wasn't just some abstract set of rules. It was a weapon, and if I knew how to use it, I could defend my lake. As I dug deeper, a pattern began to emerge. There were protections in place for property owners like me, rules that prevented neighboring associations from overstepping onto private water rights. The HOA probably didn't even know about them. Excitement coursed through me. I could almost see the scenario, them confidently building their dock, assuming I was powerless while I had a legal ace up my sleeve. Suspense built with every line I read, every loophole I uncovered. Late that night, I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my eyes, trying to process it all. The plan was forming in my mind step by step. I would have to act carefully. A single misstep and it could all backfire. But the more I studied, the more confident I became. I imagined the moment I'd confront the HOA armed with facts, regulations, and a quiet determination that they couldn't ignore. It was like rehearsing for a play, each line carefully memorized, each move calculated. Humor helped me stay sane. I imagined a dramatic slow-motion scene where I stroll up to the dock, papers in hand, citing water laws as if reciting a magic spell. I laughed at myself, shaking my head. It felt absurd, and yet the absurdity gave me strength. I wasn't just fighting rules, I was fighting ignorance, arrogance, and the sheer audacity of someone thinking they could control my lake. As the days went by, the suspense grew. The HOA continued with their projects, oblivious to the fact that I was quietly preparing my counterattack. Each nail they hammered, each board they placed on their dock added tension. It was like living in a thriller where the villain thinks they're ahead but the hero is already plotting their move. My fishing trips became reconnaissance missions. I watched, took notes, and imagined different scenarios, each more intense than the last. By the end of the week, I felt ready. The research had given me clarity, confidence, and a strategy. I knew the laws, understood the loopholes, and could foresee how the confrontation would unfold. The suspense wasn't gone, it had grown sharper. I was standing on the edge of something big, something that could completely shift the balance of power in my little lake world. And yet there was one thought that kept me awake at night. The HOA had no idea what was coming. The cops, the letters, the meetings, they had escalated this battle, but I had discovered a secret advantage they couldn't see. The tension was electric, every ripple on the lake now feeling like part of a larger story, a story that was about to reach its turning point. I just had to wait for the right moment, and then the game would truly begin. After a week of research, notes scattered across my desk like a chaotic map of legal territory, I finally had a plan. It wasn't impulsive, it wasn't angry, it was precise, calculated, and fueled by every absurd letter and meeting the HOA had thrown my way. The suspense had reached a new level. Every morning I walked past the lake, imagining how the confrontation would unfold, and every step made my heart beat faster. The first thing I did was map out the dock they were building. It was small, unassuming, but in their minds it was a power move. I measured distances, checked the local regulations about shoreline usage, and made notes about exactly where they were overstepping. Each measurement, each diagram felt like drawing the blueprint for a strategic operation. I even joked to myself that I was a general planning an assault on a fortress made of wood and rules. Next, I prepared my arsenal: legal references, citations from water law, and municipal regulations that clearly favored property owners like me. I printed them all out, stacked them neatly in a folder, and highlighted the most critical passages. I imagined the moment when I'd calmly place that folder on the table in front of the HOA board, watching their smug expressions fade as they realized they had underestimated me. Suspense crackled in my mind just thinking about it. Humor kept me sane during the preparation. I practiced my lines in the mirror, pretending to be in a dramatic courtroom. According to Section 12.4 of the State Water Code, I recited, imagining the board members frozen, blinking, unsure if I was serious. I even imagined slow-motion footage of the dock being torn down with triumphant music in the background. Ridiculous, yes, but it helped me visualize victory. The days leading up to execution were tense. The HOA continued their work, oblivious to the fact that I was ready to turn the tables. Every hammer strike, every plank added to their dock felt like a countdown. Suspense was at its peak. I watched quietly from my shoreline, pretending to fish, while in reality I was running through scenarios in my head. What if they argued? What if they ignored me? What if the cops returned? Every possibility had a response. I felt prepared, almost invincible, yet cautious. I also thought about timing. If I went too early, it might backfire. If I waited too long, they might claim more of the lake as theirs. Patience, I realized, was part of the strategy. I had learned from the cops and the letters that rushing would be a mistake. Each day I spent observing, taking notes, and rehearsing was another day that suspense built, another day that the eventual confrontation would hit harder. Finally, the day arrived. I approached the lake with my folder in hand, heart racing, trying to appear casual, almost nonchalant. The HOA was working on their dock, boards in place, hammers swinging. I cleared my throat and started talking, calmly citing the laws section by section, explaining the water rights they were violating. I watched their confident expressions falter, their gestures pause. Suspense hung in the air like thick fog. They tried to argue, of course. Their faces were red, their voices sharp. But I was ready. I calmly countered each point, referencing my notes calmly without raising my voice. It was almost cinematic. The tension was unbearable and yet strangely satisfying. The humor wasn't lost either. I imagined this scene narrated like a thriller, dramatic music playing as the unsuspecting villains realized they had been outsmarted by a quiet man with a fishing rod and legal papers. As the confrontation continued, I could see the shift in power. The HOA board, once so sure of their dominance, was now hesitant, confused, scrambling to process the legal reality they had ignored for weeks. Suspense mingled with triumph. Every second stretched, each exchange charged with tension. It felt like hours, though in reality it was only minutes. The stage was set for the final act, and I was in control. And in that moment, I realized how absurd and perfect it all was. The lake that had been my sanctuary had become a battleground. The letters and meetings were the preludes, and now, armed with knowledge and strategy, I was ready to claim victory. Suspense lingered, thick and electric, because the story wasn't over yet. The dock, the HOA, the rules, they all still needed to bend to reality, and I was about to make sure they did. The day of confrontation had arrived, and I could feel it in every nerve. The HOA board was at the lake, working on their dock like confident generals unaware that the tide was about to turn. I walked up slowly, folder in hand, trying to appear casual, but my heart pounded like a drum. Each step felt heavier than the last, suspense thick in the air. The water looked calm, deceptively so, like it had been holding its breath in anticipation of the showdown. "Good morning," I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the adrenaline surging through me. They paused, glanced at me with polite suspicion, and continued hammering. I set the folder down on the nearest dock post, opening it with deliberate care. "I've been doing some research," I said. "Turns out there are laws regarding lakes and docks that you might not be aware of." Their confident expressions flickered, a momentary crack in the armor they'd worn for weeks. Suspense built like electricity in the air. I started citing the laws calmly and clearly. Every section, every clause, every loophole I had discovered over late nights of research. I watched them stiffen, murmurs passing between them. The humor of the situation crept into my mind. Here I was, a simple fisherman, calmly standing on the shore, wielding legal citations like a sword, while the powerful HOA board, once so smug, fumbled under the weight of rules they thought they controlled. It was absurd cinematic, and I couldn't help but smirk. They tried to interrupt, to argue, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of disbelief. That's not how it works, one said. We have rules, another shot back. I stayed calm. Each argument they made was countered with facts, references, and a quiet authority that they clearly hadn't expected. Suspense surged as I realized the power shift. This wasn't just about fishing anymore. It was about standing my ground, about using knowledge to turn the absurdity of the situation into leverage. The confrontation escalated. A small crowd of neighbors had gathered, curious about the commotion. I could feel their eyes on me, sensing the tension and the absurd drama unfolding. I imagined the slow-motion shots if this were a movie, my folder of legal papers open, the board members frozen in confusion, the water glinting under the sun as if highlighting the climax of the battle. The suspense was almost unbearable, every second stretching longer than the last. Then came the moment of clarity. One of the board members finally looked at me and paused, their confident demeanor cracking. I didn't realize, they stammered. I didn't raise my voice, didn't shout or demand. I simply presented the facts calmly with evidence as if stating the obvious. The dock, their construction, their assumptions, all of it was now in question, and the realization hit them like a splash of cold water. The suspense shifted into triumph, though I stayed composed. The battle wasn't over yet, they still had to concede. As the minutes passed, their resistance weakened. I could feel the shift in energy, the subtle acknowledgement that I was not just some backyard fisherman but someone who had learned the rules, studied the law, and was prepared to enforce them calmly. Humor mingled with satisfaction. I imagined a narrator voice booming over the scene, and then the lake claimed its defender, armed with nothing but patience, knowledge, and a folder of legal papers. It was absurd but perfect. Finally, one of the members spoke, voice quieter, hesitant. We will have to reconsider the dock, they said. My pulse raced, suspense still lingering but tempered with relief. The dock, the board, the threat, they were starting to bend to reality. I had turned the tables without aggression, without threats, using only the power of preparation, knowledge, and calm determination. I stepped back, letting the moment settle. The water sparkled, the lake calm once again, though now it carried a new energy, the energy of victory, of justice quietly served. I realized how tense the past weeks had been, how every letter, call, and meeting had been a prelude to this moment. And while the confrontation was reaching its climax, I knew the story wasn't fully over. The dock was paused, the HOA humbled, but the resolution still needed time. Suspense remained, but now it was mixed with satisfaction, anticipation, and a deep, quiet pride in standing my ground. As I walked back to my favorite willow tree, fishing rod in hand, folder under my arm, I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. The confrontation had been intense, the suspense at its peak, and yet I had learned something invaluable. Knowledge is power, patience is key, and sometimes the most absurd battles can be won with calm determination. The lake was mine once again for now, but the story wasn't quite finished. Hours passed after the confrontation, and I stayed by the lake, quietly observing. The board members lingered for a moment, whispering among themselves, clearly unsettled by the legal storm I had just delivered. Every hammer I had heard earlier was now silent. The dock, which had seemed so inevitable, now looked incomplete, awkward, and powerless. Suspense still hung in the air like fog, but a new feeling had crept in triumph. I couldn't resist a small laugh. It was ridiculous when you thought about it. A man armed with a fishing rod, coffee stains on his shirt, and a folder of legal papers had just outmaneuvered the HOA board in their own absurd power struggle. Humor helped me breathe, helped me process the sheer absurdity of what had just happened. I imagined someone narrating this like a dramatic thriller. In the heart of suburbia, one man stood for his lake, armed with nothing but facts and stubbornness. Soon after, the inevitable calls and letters began. The board formally acknowledged that the dock could not continue in its current form and would have to be dismantled or relocated according to the water laws I had cited. I read the notice with a mix of disbelief and satisfaction. Victory, however, didn't feel like a sudden explosion. It was subtle, quiet, like the water reflecting the evening sun. Suspense had shifted into satisfaction, a slow burn of triumph rather than a fireworks display. Neighbors began talking, cautiously at first, then more openly. Some approached me shaking their heads, saying they had never seen anything like it. One even joked, you could start a school on how to handle an HOA with just a folder of laws. I laughed, appreciating the humor, but deep down I knew it wasn't just funny. It was a lesson in patience, preparation, and knowing your rights. The suspense had drawn them in, but the result held them captive. The story was as compelling to them as it had been to me. The dock, once a symbol of control, now seemed like a monument to absurdity. I walked along the shoreline, nodding every plank and post that had been abandoned or paused. The tension from previous weeks had melted into a quiet awareness of what had been accomplished. The lake, calm once again, seemed to approve. I felt a strange pride in knowing that my love for this water, combined with research, persistence, and humor, had shifted the balance of power. Humor had remained my anchor throughout. I imagined posting a sign by the lake. Victory achieved, no docks allowed without legal consultation. It was ridiculous, yes, but perfectly cathartic. I also imagined a small victory party for one, a chair by the willow tree, coffee in hand, and the satisfaction of watching the water ripple with quiet approval. The suspense had kept my adrenaline high, but the humor allowed me to enjoy the moment fully. As I reflected, I realized that this experience had changed me. The confrontation, the suspense, the legal research, and the absurdity had taught me something important. Standing your ground doesn't mean raising your voice or creating chaos. It means being prepared, calm, and informed. I had turned a stressful, almost surreal situation into a personal victory, and the lesson lingered longer than any moment of fear or tension. The sun began to dip lower, casting golden reflections across the water. The dock stood incomplete, silent, a reminder of the power of knowledge and patience. Suspense had driven me to the edge, and humor had kept me sane, but now there was clarity. The lake, my sanctuary, had survived the storm of bureaucracy and absurd rules. I could finally breathe again, cast my line freely, and enjoy the simple peace that had been threatened for weeks. And yet there was still a subtle thrill left in the air. The HOA had learned, perhaps reluctantly, that rules alone were not enough to control someone who knew their rights. I had won this battle, but the lake had reminded me that vigilance was necessary. Every ripple, every rustle of the trees, every splash of a fish reminded me that peace must sometimes be defended. Humor, patience, and knowledge had turned the tide. Victory was mine for now, but the suspense of life by the lake would always linger, quietly reminding me that battles may come, but they could be met with strategy and calm determination. The dust had settled, the dock was dismantled, and for the first time in weeks I could sit by my lake without glancing over my shoulder. The suspense that had followed me like a shadow finally began to lift, replaced with a calm sense of triumph. Yet even in victory, I couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. The letters, the meetings, the cops, the absurdity of it all, it had been surreal, exhausting, and somehow exhilarating. As I sat under my favorite willow tree, rod in hand, I thought about the lessons I had learned. The HOA had thought rules alone were enough to intimidate, to control, to bend reality to their will. But they hadn't counted on me taking the time to understand those rules, to study, to strategize. Knowledge, I realized, was more powerful than threats, more powerful than authority when wielded with patience and precision. Humor, too, had been a secret weapon. Imagining dramatic slow-motion scenes, ridiculous narrators, and cinematic confrontations had kept my sanity intact, and had somehow made the battle more manageable. Neighbors began approaching me cautiously, curious about the outcome. They asked questions, shared their own frustrations, and sometimes just shook their heads in disbelief. I told the story in small doses, careful to balance humor with reality. The cops came over my fishing lake, I said, and all I had was a folder of laws and a stubborn attitude, and somehow it worked. Laughter followed, and for a moment the absurdity of the situation was shared and appreciated. Suspense had drawn people in, but humor made them stay. I realized that my lake, once just a quiet retreat, had become a stage for a personal victory. Every ripple of water, every rustle of leaves, every splash of a fish reminded me of the tension I had faced and the triumph I had earned. The experience had strengthened something inside me, a confidence, a patience, and a belief that careful preparation and calm determination could overcome even the most unreasonable challenges. The suspense of past weeks had transformed into a quiet pride, subtle but enduring. Humor remained my anchor. I imagined writing a guidebook, how to survive an HOA battle with fishing and a folder of laws. It sounded ridiculous, but I knew it would have been helpful to anyone facing similar absurdity. The situation had been stressful, yes, but the laughter I found in imagining dramatic narratives, cinematic slow motion, and ironic victories had made the tension bearable. Suspense and humor had worked together like a tandem, keeping me sharp and alert without letting me break under pressure. As the days passed, peace returned to the lake. The water looked the same, calm and reflective, but I saw it differently now. It wasn't just a place to fish, it was a reminder of perseverance, intelligence, and quiet victory. The HOA had been humbled, the dock dismantled, and my mornings returned to their original purpose: tranquility, reflection, and a good cup of coffee beside the water. Suspense remained, yes, but in a new form, a gentle awareness that life would always throw challenges, but they could be met with strategy, knowledge, and calm humor. I thought about the absurdity of it all. The cops, the letters, the meetings, none of it would have seemed real if I hadn't lived it, yet somehow all of it had led to growth. I had learned patience, how to observe without reacting too quickly, and how to use knowledge as leverage in situations that seemed impossible. Humor had softened the edges, suspense had sharpened my focus, and the lake had remained my constant. Finally, I leaned back, letting the water ripple around my feet, and allowed myself a small smile. The ordeal was over, the victory complete, but the story lingered, a reminder that even in the most ridiculous circumstances, perseverance, preparation, and a little humor could turn the tide. My lake, my sanctuary, had been defended not with anger or force, but with calm determination and cleverness. The suspense of the battle was behind me, but the lessons and laughter would stay forever. As I cast my line one last time for the evening, I whispered to the lake, "We did it. We survived the absurdity, the drama, and the bureaucracy, and somehow we won." The water shimmered as if in agreement, and for the first time in weeks, I felt completely at peace. The story had reached its conclusion, suspense had served its purpose, and humor had carried me through. My lake was mine again, quiet, calm, and victorious. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one. The truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.